Hello, I thought we'd celebrate Halloween with an Irish ghost story. This particular one is loosely, admittedly, based upon one of Hans Christian Andersen's most nauseatingly twee stories, The Little Match Girl. A story which I really don't like. So I've redesigned it and called it The Old Match Woman. The old woman huddled, shivering and cold in a corner of the abandoned factory. The wind howled through the broken windows. Through the hole in the ceiling, the snow still fell. She drew her ragged coat about her and looked at the pile of twigs before her, of broken bits of box, of pieces of old pallet that she'd scrabbled together during the day. And she thought of the matchbox in her pocket with one last remaining match. Dare she light it? Dare she use up what heat it would provide and then be left with nothing after it had gone, into the wee dark small hours of the night when it would get colder and colder and colder? And she thought that she dare not yet, not to the last possible minute. And her mind strayed to the laudanum bottle in her other pocket, which contained barely a spoonful left of that wonderful, warming liquor. And she thought, dare she use up the laudanum yet, to take away the pain in what was left of her jaw? And again she thought that she dare not, for the night would get colder and colder and colder, and she had only one dose, barely even that, left of the laudanum. She should save it until she absolutely needed it. And as she sat thinking these cold and unhappy thoughts, there came crunching of footsteps, walking across the old factory floor towards her, and she became fearful and glanced up, for it was not unknown for people to rob, people to murder, over even things as paltry as a bit of firewood or a dribble of laudanum in an old bottle. The man who approached her, emerging through the darkness of the factory into the pool of moonlight that came down through the gap in the ceiling, was not the usual kind of man that she had seen, as ill-dressed and hungry as she was herself, living out in abandoned buildings around London. This was a man in the ivory green livery of a coachman, a well-dressed man, a finely dressed man, a servant, but a well-dressed servant nonetheless, with a great top hat upon his head and the collars of his coat pulled up against that biting wind. She strained in the light to see his face, but the shadows fell in such a way that all she could see was darkness. And the voice that echoed from the darkness, calling the old woman by name and asking if she would do him the honour of allowing him to sit with her in the night, had about it the lilt of County Cork, and at once her memories flew back to her childhood in Ireland, to her childhood in Cork. She thought of her friends and her family, of the children she had grown up amongst, of her life on the farm. She thought of the old priest. She thought of her aunts and her uncles and her parents and her brothers and her sisters. And she couldn't say why, but for some reason she found the presence of this man, this echo of a past almost forgotten, strangely comforting. And she began to talk to him about her past in Ireland. And although her jaw was long since crumbled away to nothing, poisoned by the phosphorus that was once used in that very factory to make the very matches of which she had but one left in her box, such that normally when she spoke it was a squelching, a slobbering noise, barely comprehensible to anyone, yet somehow this man, this absolute stranger who sat before her, seemed to understand every word she said. And not only did he listen to what she was saying, but he responded in kind with stories that he knew of people that they'd had in common back in the old days, back in County Cork. And when she'd finished talking about her mother, he suggested that maybe they should start that little fire that she had built up there. And when she looked nervously at the pile and looked up at the gap in the ceiling where the snow was still falling down, he said, "Never mind, Mother. I have more wood to add to it, and he produced from inside the folds of his coat some great sizable logs, and she wondered why on earth he was carrying them about with him, but she was not one to look a gift horse in the mouth, and she offered him the matchbox. And he took out the one remaining match, and she cautioned him to be careful, for once it was gone, and if he failed to get the fire going at the first, well, what else were they to do? But he struck the match, and it flared into life, and he lit the wood, and at once they had a blazing fire between them. And she fell to talking of her first husband, of the marriage that had started out so promisingly, so well, of how he had seemed such a good man, and really he was good for the first few years, and it wasn't really until after they'd moved away to London itself. And the drink and the pub fights and the problems began to pile up upon them, and the debts and the money worries that he'd started to turn nasty. And when finally he'd died, well, she'd struggled on. She'd done her best. She'd found a second husband, but with him she hadn't even had those few years of goodness at the start, for he'd gone rotten almost instantly. He had been far heavier a drinker than her first husband, and far quicker with his fists than ever her first husband was. And that had been a bad marriage, but it had given her a child, and she'd loved that child for the few years of its life. There was never another child after that one was buried. And soon she was burying her second husband, and she'd never had wish for a third. And as she told her tale, the coachman reached in to his coat pocket and brought out a flask and shared the whisky within it with her. And she had to say it was the finest whisky she had ever tasted in her life, even in her good days in her childhood on the farm as a young woman, when she'd first had the odd nip or two. She'd had nothing like what this coachman had to offer her. They'd talked long into the night, and the moon was very high above them and shining directly in through the gap in the ceiling, shining down not only upon the coachman himself, but she saw then the coach beyond him, and she heard the horses at the front of the coach snorting and stamping their hooves upon the floor, and she understood them. She watched as the fire burnt down to mere embers, and she was ready. She stood to her feet, shaking and uncertain, the pain in her jaw throbbing, and she downed the last of the laudanum and discarded the bottle. "You'll not be needing any more of that," said the coachman, and reached out his hand to her. And she took his hand, and he led her, stately as a duchess, across to the finely appointed coach, an exquisitely appointed coach, and she sat on seats covered in cushions of silk, beautifully embroidered, such that she had never seen in all of her life. And the coachman went and took his seat at the front and geed up the horses, and the old woman sat back with a smile upon what was left of her face and wondered where her journey would take her. Thank you.